Our guest today is president of the Joyce Foundation. She honors us by coming every year to give a State of the State, and we are very grateful. The Joyce Foundation has assets of $950 million and makes grants of $45 million a year. Their priorities include, number one, improving educational outcomes for low-income children, employment and workforce issues, and energy efficiency and water quality. Our guest today holds an honors degree in English from Brown University and a Master's of Management in Finance and Marketing from Northwestern. And she is so smart and so lucky that she brought her mother today. So her mother, Pat, is here. Let's give her a City Club welcome. Pat Alberding, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago, Ellen Alberding. Ellen? All right, Ellen. There we go.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for that really nice introduction. And I really appreciate being invited back for my 8th City Club speech. I guess I haven't worn out my welcome yet, so appreciate it very much. My mother is here today, and I want to acknowledge her, and also my sister, Jane McCarthy, who works at the Ounce of Prevention. So it's nice to have friends from philanthropy, friends from the grant-making world, my fabulous team from Joyce, but it's really nice to have my family here. Jane and I were raised in a family that was very politically active and also had a tilt towards social justice, and I think we both feel extremely grateful that we've been able to find work that helps advance the issues that we were raised thinking about and promoting from our various youngest times. So those of you who have children, be careful what you tell them, because sometimes they actually act on it. I know that many people in this room know Joyce really well, but I just wanted to take a little bit of time, just a couple of minutes, to describe what the underlying values are that help us make decisions about what areas to work on. There are a lot of policy issues that we could choose to focus on. The list of things that we don't do is much longer than the list of things that we do. But we're not making arbitrary choices. The things we work on reflect a set of values that are primary in the hearts and minds, both of us, our staff, and our board. First, we believe that communities are stronger when they share benefits broadly among their people. So we invest in areas where we can improve the quality of life, promote community vitality, and strive for a fair society. Second, we want to support policy and ideas and programs that we have some confidence will work. So we invest a lot of money in research and data. Third, we believe in the critical importance of civil society and the public systems that contribute to it. Public education, fair elections, public safety, fair courts, and civil dialogue. And believe me, we could use a little more civil dialogue in our country right now. Yeah. Finally, and important for everybody in this room, because we believe it strongly, and I suspect most of you do too, the actions of individuals, when put together, the collective action of individuals really can make a difference. And a great illustration of that final point is the clarion call of the brave and determined individuals right here in our city, in Baltimore, in Ferguson, in cities around the country, who have stood up and protested, expressing legitimate concerns about social injustice and inequality. The words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. are so often invoked in situations like the one we're in now, and there's a reason for that, because he so aptly and deeply articulated the concerns of people who were being unheard. Back in 1967, in a speech that he gave then, he was condemning violence, as he always did, but he recognized that street protests and rioting were, quote, the language of the unheard. 50 years later, too many people in our society still are unheard. That is a core message of the Black Lives Matter movement, And it underlies what is truly, truly terrible about the crisis in Flint, Michigan. Hundreds of people complaining, documenting, holding up water bottles filled with dirty water, and being ignored. Right here in Chicago, we've had our own situations. For decades, 2 coal-fired power plants spewed mercury and other pollution directly into 2 neighborhoods, Pilsen and Little Village. Neighborhoods protested. They tried to act. They really pushed back, but they too were ignored or diminished for many years. To his credit, Mayor Emanuel finally got those plants to close, and Joyce is proud to be supporting the plans to redevelop the areas around those plants as community assets instead of community liabilities. Yeah, we're happy about that. We're happy about that, but how many other Flints are out there right now? It's time for us all to sit up and take notice and listen to the folks who are being unheard. But let me shift to talk about a couple of specific issues, and those are environment and gun violence. I've talked about both of these issues before in this room, and in both cases, I've talked about incremental progress. Right now, though, I think there is more than incremental progress. I wouldn't call it a sea change on guns. I would call it a sea change on environment, but we are seeing substantial movement in the right direction. These are both huge issues. We're aware of that. There are powerful forces that are lined up against progress, and it might seem in some ways like a fool's errand for a foundation the size of ours. In fact, we regularly ask ourselves, how much can we really get done on this, given that our resources are a drop in the bucket compared to the massive, massive amounts of money that are arrayed against us. But we do have more than money. We have patience, for example, with a long-term view. We're not driven by concerns about the next election or the next financial quarter, and we're willing to take calculated risks that others might reject. With that said, let me turn quickly to climate change. Most of us, at one time or another, probably thought of climate change as something remote, years down the line, and not directly affecting us. Sort of like this guy. Yeah, but things have changed. This was Christmas Day in New York City. You know, it's funny, kind of, but it's also pretty weird. Climate change is really disrupting weather all around the world, and it has huge impacts. Drought affects the income of farmers and prices at the grocery store. More frequent and intense rainstorms send sewage flowing into the Great Lakes, disgusting, and farm fertilizer into Lake Erie, where we've seen serious toxic algae outbreaks the last 2 summers. That green water and that green goo were scooped out of Lake Erie not so long ago. Another disgusting thing, stormwater backups flood basements across the Chicago area. I hope not, but I bet there are people in this room who've been affected by that. And finally, floodwaters in Mississippi, from the Mississippi River, inundated communities in southern Illinois and Missouri, cutting short some people's vacations. Mine too. Obviously, this is not good, but it's not too late to make a difference. We do see progress. The Paris summit just last month was historic. 195 nations committed to cutting emissions. And we're proud that Joyce Environment Program Director Ed Miller led the U.S. philanthropy delegation to Paris. He kept us entertained with his selfies and celebrity photos. But on a more serious note, he had a terrific series of extremely illuminating blog posts, which were widely circulated. So what comes next? Well, it's not going to grab the attention of the public as Paris did, but our region will play an incredibly important role. As you may know, most of the electricity in homes and office buildings throughout the Midwest comes from coal. And as you can see on this slide, Midwest states are responsible for 25% of the U.S. electric power generated by burning coal. So we have a responsibility to do something about that. We also have an opportunity to do something about that. Research tells us that the fastest, cheapest way to cut pollution caused by burning coal is to use less of it. In other words, energy efficiency, and that's where we focus our efforts. It isn't really that hard, especially for large commercial users, to cut back in a way that has impact. Here's an example. The Chicago Commercial Buildings Initiative. You may not know it, but I bet many people in this room who work downtown are probably part of this program, which is funded by Joyce and others. 50 Chicago commercial buildings covering more than 40 million square feet have committed to reduce energy use by 20% over 5 years. They're doing this with simple improvements in lighting, heating, cooling, and other strategies, and they're saving money, collectively $2.5 million a year on their electrical bills. Wind and solar are also important and growing, and all of these strategies are good for the community and the economy. Companies save money on their utility bills, and workers get good paying jobs in the clean energy industry. These jobs are growing. Last year, the Clean Energy Trust reported 104,000 clean energy jobs in Illinois alone, and they'll have a report out in a couple of weeks that'll give us fresher numbers, and I'm hoping growing numbers in that field. The actions of individuals also matter, and they add up. Consumers, community groups, advocates and voters, people who take a stand on policy because they know it matters and know it can help improve lives. We have an example here today. Lorena Lopez. Lorena is a community organizer at Faith in Place, which engages people in environmental issues as an expression of their faith. With Joyce funding, Lorena works on energy efficiency and renewable energy policy in African American and Latino communities to make sure their voice is heard in the policy debate. Last November, Joyce provided Lorena with a very small grant, we thought it was small, to attend a climate policy meeting at Georgetown. The main speaker was Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez from Honduras, who's one of Pope Francis's top climate advisors. It turned out that Lorena was one of the very few Spanish speakers at the meeting, so she and the Cardinal hit it off. They took this selfie together. But more important, he blessed Lorena and he blessed her work. I guess it's also important that she subsequently was invited to a meeting at the White House with the top advisors there, but I think maybe this was the best part. So it may seem like a long way from Little Village to the White House via the Pope, but Lorena made that journey and we're very proud of her. Lorena's here, if you could just raise your hand. As well as the director of Faith in Place, Reverend Brian Sauter. He's here also. You guys do such a great job. I'd like to turn now to an even more difficult issue, which is gun violence. As we all know, gun violence devastates families and communities. Homicides committed with guns disproportionately affect low-income and minority youth and destroy neighborhoods that are already struggling under the weight of poverty and inequality. 92 Americans die each day as a result of gun violence. By far the majority of these are suicides. Mass shootings, as horrifying as they may be, account for only 2% of these deaths, but they do create a pervasive atmosphere of fear. Given that the theme of my remarks is progress, you may be wondering, where is the progress on gun violence? We've already had 200 shootings this year. Ultimately, we need a national solution. I understand that. But in the meantime, we are making significant progress at the state and local level, progress that is moving our country in the right direction. Let me explain. Most Americans agree that guns are just too easy to get, and they are fed up with the unwillingness of Congress to enact the most basic common sense measures to keep guns out of the hands of those who pose a risk to themselves and others. So Americans are taking action. Here are 5 signs of progress. 1, many states have passed common sense gun laws on their own. They're not waiting for Congress to find its moral center. 2, courts are upholding strong gun violence prevention laws against challenges by the gun lobby. 3, there is growing grassroots activism. 4, despite efforts by the gun lobby to cut federal funding for research into gun violence, which is outrageous, A growing body of privately funded research provides clear evidence that smart gun policy saves lives. And 5, President Obama's recent executive actions make it more difficult for dangerous people to get guns. The president's actions will save lives. Let me go through a couple of these in a little more detail. In the states, I mentioned progress. Since Sandy Hook, a remarkable 125 common sense gun laws have been passed in 41 states. We know this because of the work of an organization and Joyce grantee, the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, which tracks every single piece of state gun legislation in the country. These new common sense laws have even been enacted in gun-friendly states like Louisiana and Georgia, both of which have outlawed gun possession by domestic violence offenders. Others have expanded background checks. And in the courts, it is true that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2008 that the Second Amendment does protect a person's right to keep a handgun in the home for self-protection. But the court was careful to make it clear that there are limits to Second Amendment rights. Justice Scalia himself, who wrote the opinion, said, and I quote, "There are undoubtedly limits to a person's Second Amendment rights." Exactly what those limits are have been the subject of hundreds of lawsuits, many of which filed by the gun lobby, challenging gun safety laws around the country. I'm happy to report that the gun lobby is not doing very well on that front. Since 2008, courts have upheld common sense gun safety laws 93% of the time. Yeah, good courts. We have a great example. We have a great example in our own backyard. Maybe some of you are from Highland Park. Highland Park passed an assault weapons ban in 2013. The gun lobby challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court. But just last month, the court refused to hear the appeal, leaving intact Highland Park's ban on the very weapons used in the San Bernardino shootings. And there they are. Finally, yeah, go Highland Park. Grassroots activism is really on the rise, and I have some numbers on that. Every Town for Gun Safety, which is one of the leaders in this movement, has seen its email list more than triple in the last 3 years to 3 million people. The group now has 17,000 active volunteers and 100,000 donors. Other major advocacy groups are reporting similar trends. Meanwhile, the NRA saw a huge drop in revenues from its members, down 27% in 2014, according to its own documents. And that was the most recent reporting year. That tells you something about trends that I think is important to know. Finally, let's talk a little bit about research. Research really matters in this issue. Good policy is based on good research, which is why it is so outrageous that the gun lobby has been able to prevail on its allies in Congress to cut federal funding for research on gun violence prevention by the Centers for Disease Control. The CDC should be the largest and most important source of public health data on guns, but instead it has been muzzled by Congress. That said, a few weeks ago, President Obama announced executive actions to reduce gun violence, and for each of his actions, he cited research and data, most of which I'm proud to say Joyce had a hand in funding. For example, he opened his remarks by noting that the United States is the only advanced country on earth that sees this kind of mass violence erupt with this kind of frequency. How do we know this? Because researchers at Harvard have documented the chilling fact that an American is 25 times more likely to be killed with a gun than someone living in another developed country. That red line on the left of the graph is the United States, and the ones to the right of it represent other developed countries. The president called for stronger background checks because we know they reduce gun deaths. How do we know it? Because of research by Daniel Webster at Johns Hopkins. Professor Webster contrasted actions taken by 2 states, Connecticut and Missouri. Connecticut passed a law requiring a permit and background check to buy a gun, and Missouri did the opposite, repealing its background check law. So what was the result? Connecticut saw a 40% reduction in gun homicides. Missouri tragically experienced a 25% increase in gun homicides after repealing its law. So good policy saves lives. Bad policy does the opposite. Finally, one further sad point. The president described guns as a product that now kills almost as many Americans as car accidents. How do we know? A study by the Violence Policy Center, which documented that in 21 states, gun deaths now surpass deaths from car crashes. And yes, Illinois is one of those states. So where do we go from here? The executive actions taken by the president are significant, and we know they will achieve their intended results. We expect they will help somewhat in Chicago, because requiring more gun buyers to undergo background checks will help stem the flow of crime guns from states like Indiana, which have incredibly weak gun laws. I'm optimistic about the way things have been heading in the state and federal courts, the growth of grassroots advocacy, the new gun safety laws, and the fact that we no longer have to assume that the gun lobby will always win, because it won't. Another reason I'm optimistic is the incredible, inspiring commitment of those who have suffered unimaginable loss, parents who have lost their children to gun violence. In a moment, I would like to introduce you to a few of those folks, but first I'd like to tell you about the circumstances that led them to become leaders in the movement to stop gun violence. This is Tommy Vanden Burke. On April 25th, 1992, Tommy was shot and killed by strangers while leaving a party. He had been invited to the party to DJ, and since he was doing well in school, his father said okay and actually drove him to the party where he was killed. Tommy was 15 years old. This is Blair Holt. Blair was shot and killed on a CTA bus in 2007 while riding to his grandparents' place after school. A teenager boarded the bus and just started shooting. Blair shielded a classmate from the bullets. His dad is a Chicago police officer. His mom is a Chicago Fire Department chief. They taught Blair to protect people, so he did. Blair was 16 years old. And this is Terrell Bosley. On April 4th, 2006, Terrell was shot and killed in a church parking lot while helping a friend unload his drums from a car. Terrell played six-string bass in the church band and was pursuing a degree in music. He had just called his mom to check in and tell her he was doing great. Terrell was 18. With us today are parents of these very fine young people. Tom Vanden Burke and Pam Bosley. Blair's mom, Annette, a good friend, had hoped to be here but had to work. We honor her as well. Tom works with at-risk youth as CEO of UCAN, a great social service agency, and Pam and Annette are founders of the organization Purpose Over Pain, which helps other families who've lost children to guns and works to prevent gun violence. Please join me in recognizing Tom Vanden Burke and Pam Bosley, whose courage and grace, strength and power are so inspiring. I know that Tom, Pam, and Annette are not alone. Not every parent has the courage to do what they have done, but many, many people, including people in this room, have been touched by gun violence. The actions of individual Americans like these will overcome the money of the gun lobby, just like the stories of individual activists like Lorena Lopez have become so much more effective than those of the climate deniers. But we cannot become complacent. We need to sustain the momentum that exists and build on the progress we've made, because those who want to turn back the clock on these two issues are hard at work to undo the progress. Climate change and gun violence prevention are areas in which anti-intellectualism and anti-science views have been used to manipulate the debate. What Joyce seeks to do with our resources is to ensure that reliable, fact-based research is used to shape effective policies. Even if we disagree on specific solutions, there is no excuse for denying science. With the help of all of us in this room and the support of Americans across the nation coming together in collective action, decisions on big issues that once seemed immovable are now moving in the right direction. I appreciate your continued interest in these challenges that we face together. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you.
If you have a question, Jack's back there. Knock them off. Well, how about a big round of applause? Do we have a question? Where? You're supposed to write it out, but okay, since you're basically, you're it, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, background checks, and Nina can probably give a lot more, Nina Vinnick, who runs our program, can probably give us a lot more detail. The question is about background checks, but I think they vary state to state, and they're checking for prior arrests, in some cases domestic violence offenses, if you've been involuntarily committed, if you have mental health issues and so on. So those kinds of checks are part of many states, but not all states. They're fairly minimal. They don't take much time, but they do work, even in states where they're not very complicated. Yeah, it is fairly shocking. I mean, the domestic violence, the idea that you have to pass a law to keep guns away from convicted domestic violence offenders is sort of like a, wow, okay, we should be able to get that one done, right? There's somebody in the back there.
We have a written question there. Oh. Changing the rules, Miss Alberding. Your 8th time here.
Is this properly previewed?
I think it's easy, don't you? Standing up here, trying to. Here's a question that, well, since we don't have many others, so we might as well go because it's a little bit off target here. Kathy, is that Kathy Gregg? There is a 70% unemployment nationally for blind or visually impaired adults. She works at the Friedman Place. Where I work, the percentage is nearly 100%. Basically, she's asking, what can Joyce Foundation do to help corporate America incorporate the blind into the workforce? Thought it'd be easy, eh?
One of the programs that Joyce has is on employment for under or unemployed adults, and we invest heavily in strategies for bringing people along in their education and their skills in order to get good paying jobs. There's no particular or specific focus on people with visual impairments, but I am sure that people with visual impairments do benefit from these programs, but I can't get much more specific than that.
Okay. Well, last question. This is from Anthony Cole, a board member. You know what this fund probably is. Well, here's the question. I can't read. Some fund, the Chala. Okay, this is not a reading test, or we'll go on. Are there policy efforts at the state level that can be done to reduce gun violence? What might those be?
Well, if you're talking about Illinois, for sure. I mean, we could beef up our background check system. We could eliminate the gun show loophole. And I don't know, Nina, what else do you think we should need to do in Illinois? Licensed gun dealers, that would be a good one. I mean, one of the amazing things about car crashes and gun deaths exceeding car crashes cars are more heavily regulated than guns by a long shot.
Not that I'd ever be political, but we have a lot of late returns coming in, so there seems to be a surge.
From what precinct?
From the river wards. No one knows what the river wards. You know what the river wards are, but that's it. Paul Batts, on climate change, does it seem that the public opinion is shifting, or more that the politicians are catching up with the public?
Well, Paul, I guess it's probably a little bit of both, and I also think business is pushing it as well. I mean, there's so much data that shows that it's good for business and it's good for jobs, and I think that helps turn the tide a little bit. And I think the climate deniers probably went a little overboard and became marginalized over time.
2 more questions. That's it. We always end on time, unless there's some precincts that haven't even had a chance to vote. All right. Very quick question, and it's anonymous, but beggars can't be choosers. After the Paris
Climate conference.
See how tough that is? After the Paris Climate Conference, what should Chicago be doing?
Chicago needs to be focusing on energy efficiency and cutting back on use of coal-fired electricity. That's the number one goal.
Okay, last question. No late returns. Debbie Horner, American Heart Association. How does the foundation determine its policy priorities? Do you consider social determinants as a context for setting your agenda?
Social determinants. Debbie, you should join our board, and you could help me figure that out. If you look at our policy priorities over time, our basic priorities were set quite some time ago by a board that existed in the 80s, and we really have not strayed that much from them because we feel that our role in encouraging advancements in policy in our 6 program areas, which we can probably throw up on the screen, give us leverage, and we have a particular advantage working there because of who's on our staff and who's on our board. So that said, we have evolved over time when there's opportunity, the politics change on an issue or new issues come up, or there's a surge of interest in something, we'll move somewhat within the confines of our policy programs, but I don't see us changing much going forward.
Parting gift.